Hi everyone, welcome to Coffee Break with Your Soul. My name is Maggie. I'm absolutely thrilled to be back after quite a while and resuming conversations with ordinary people about their ordinary awakenings. And today I am absolutely thrilled to be talking to Jez Alborough, who's an author of over 45 children's books. And he's also author of 2 books for adults. And one of those books is the Life Beyond Personality, Part 1, The Story of You. And I have a hard copy here. And the other one, I don't have a hard copy, but I have a nice image of my Kindle version, The Infinite Journey. This is book number 2. Hi, Jez.
Hi, Maggie. Hi.
I am so happy that we're finally doing this. And so I was thinking, can you tell us a little bit first about these 2 books, sort of how they came about and why 2 books, and sort of in a nutshell, what's the difference between the 2?
Well, they're actually one book divided into 2 because it just grew to a certain size. And that's because I wanted to kind of lay everything out without missing anything. So it was a comprehensive kind of sweep of this subject, which is obviously massive. So it grew, and then it naturally said, oh, that's part 1, that's part 2. Why did I write them? Well, I'm a writer. As you saw, I've done all these picture books, and I love words, and I love, in picture books, you're expressing stories with pictures and words. So that was my job for 40 or so years. And with, this is like the ultimate story, hence the title, Story of You. In human life, it can be, I mean, that sounds very grand, but it's a hell of a story to tell when whatever happened to me happened. And naturally, I guess the artist in me kind of arose and wanted to try and share it and express it as much as I could, which is obviously it's difficult with this subject, but that's the challenge, and that's the creativity arising, trying to do that. Yeah, it was an amazing thing to write them. I mean, I was I don't know how to put it. I was absorbed in the process. And you've just said just before we went on air, as it were, sometimes whether you don't know how the videos you make appear so good, because you sometimes feel like it's chaos while you're doing it, or how it happens. I mean, I look back on those books, and I mean, it's just like a dream. I was so absorbed in the writing of them. I'd be up here writing at 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning, and it was a feeling of something that wanted to happen, and I just got out of the way and watched it happen through me. All artists have that, but.
Yes, absolutely. I think artists of all people definitely have this sort of more intimate sense of that, something speaking through them, or something happening through them. It's almost like they're channels of something that's bigger than themselves, that they're getting out of their way.
Yes. Which is a very interesting theme with our general subject of waking up here, I guess, isn't it? Yeah.
Definitely. I think we're gonna talk a little bit more. We're gonna talk. That's the trouble. As I was telling you before we started, that it's such a vast topic. This journey of awakening is a fascinating one, and it's so rich, and it's ever evolving in a sense, and it's also unique to different people. Different people go through it in different way, which is what I personally love about that no story is really the same story. There may be a lot of sort of commonalities and similarities and so on, but ultimately it's a very unique, personal, funnily enough, in a way, journey. But I have to say that what I really, really appreciate about your book, the format in this case, which is, for those of you who may not read Jez's books, is a sort of a conversational format. So you're being almost interviewed in a sense by a person. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? You know, the format and how that came about and who that person actually was.
Yes, so that's a guy called Matthew, who's a friend of mine who lives, you know, a couple of miles away. And I wanted him to kind of draw it out of me. And I wanted him to represent the reader so that it would be a way of him hopefully asking the questions that somebody reading it might want to ask. So I kind of used him in that way. And I think it worked really well because we had these, what I call traveling conversations. You don't really know where they're going to go. Well, like we're going to have today, you know, but as long as you're honest and open, you take that together and something comes out of it. So it was a way of drawing out the material. I came up with the subjects usually because I knew what needed to be covered to be comprehensive on this subject, you know, and, yeah, so it makes it kind of more digestible, I hope. And, you know, and I try and include lots of personal stuff again, like, because, you know, ordinary people, I'm just an ordinary person. And so there's this balance between giving how it happened for me or how things happened for me or incidents that happened against, you know, you don't want too much of that because it's not going to be like that for the reader.
Yes.
But a small amount of it is important to show that, yeah, I'm just a normal guy like you are reading the book, of course.
And, you know, I have to say, so this is what surprised me, because I actually am not a big fan of that sort of format, you know, generally speaking, this sort of interview conversation, like in the book. But in this case, I really, really appreciate it. And I'll tell you why I appreciate it so much, because I really applauded your openness to often what could be considered difficult questions, you know, like really this, sometimes Matthew seemed to almost like put you in a, you know, on the spot.
And I love that, Maggie. When that happened, I was like, great, you know, and there was a point in the process of making the books where he was just getting really frustrated. Like, I don't get it. I don't, you know, and I thought, great, you know, because people will be feeling that. And I used that and I fed that into the book. That maybe in the book that you didn't read, I don't know, but I fed that into the book because I thought this is important. That's not to be cut out. And then we went into that because can be frustrating.
But it is, and the thing is that, you know, at least at the very beginning, and of course I can only ever speak for myself, but I know that I don't only speak for myself, that this is an experience of many people. There is a frustration. There, you know, these terms flying around. You know, there is no self, and you know, there's nothing to do, and this is, you know, and it's just, there's just this, you know, and so on and so forth, and it's all nice, and I know that we continue to read these books and listen to these people despite this frustration, because we connect to something. There's a knowing that whatever is being spoken about speaks to some kind of truth. And I think this is why, even though we may be frustrated at the start, you know, we continue to read. And I love that you recognize that. I love that you, despite now, you know, being where you're at with your experience and your understanding, you know, that you don't forget what it's like to be perhaps at the beginning of this process, or maybe in the middle where you're completely confused and you don't know you don't know anything anymore, right? So I really appreciated that format. I appreciate that the questions were coming from someone who's sort of not really into it, but interested and probing in a way that I can see how so many people would be actually afraid of these questions or will try to avoid these questions, you know. But no, you were completely open to every question, no matter how difficult.
Yeah.
And the result of that also was this incredible clarity, you know, with which you speak. And I have to say that it's something that I rarely come across, to be frank, where you're speaking from clarity, but you're also there's both the very personal and impersonal, the humane, you know, and not too much woo-woo, but also not too much of the non-woo-woo, you know, like there is like there's like a perfect balance. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you talked about how some teachers, people hear and they can feel there's something in it, but they're just left confused. And I'm not interested in doing that to people, because there's a reason for it. Like because the main engine of going into this, as far as I'm concerned, and what I use in terms of sharing this, is inquiry. So whatever those questions are and those confusions, they're like doorways that you can, if you go deep into it, travel deep into those questions, you're going deep into this. So whatever doorway you pick, you said earlier, like there's so many subjects we could talk about today, you know, whichever one we pick, if you go deep into it, then you're going deep into inquiry into what this is. So I suppose, I'm, you know, some teachers say you can't understand and there's nothing to get and drop it all, the idea of getting anything. And I'm not like that at all, because there are some things you can understand. And this is quite controversial for me to say that with some people, I believe, right?
Don't worry, you and I, either me or I, will eventually be burning at the non-dual stake.
Yeah. The police, I can hear the non-dual police pulling up outside as I speak. Yeah. So there are some things you can understand. And for this, I would say you need to understand. You know, you can't get this if you're, I mean, this is, you have to have a certain, well, you've got to have willingness, you've got to have a yearning for this, and you've got to have an absolute drive to ask those questions and be willing to find out the answers, because they're often maybe things you don't want the answer to be like that.
Absolutely, the openness and the yearning, they're just either there or they're not, and whether they're there or not is not an issue. You know, it is not a matter of judging anyone over the fact that they are or they're not.
We're all made how we're made, yeah.
Absolutely, and but I think what you're saying, and I love that. Again, by the way, I was telling Jez that I thought that I would suffer some kind of neck injury, because as I was reading his book, I found myself nodding so much that I thought, you know, my neck's gonna start to hurt. But no, because I genuinely literally found myself on the same page with you, pretty much page after page, so to speak. And although I'm sure that I think when we first spoke, we actually, I think we found ourselves sort of not being on the same page sort of initially.
I can't remember what that was, but
I don't even remember what that was about, but I know I
you were wrong.
Of course. And no, but you know, and even the fact that we don't really remember that means that, you know, it's just it's really not felt sort of personally, so to speak. But I do remember that eventually we realized that we were talking about the same thing, only in a sort of a different
way. This is why the language thing and the words is so important, because if I say, you know, X and you hear Y, we're not communicating well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is why in the book at the back I have a glossary of some of the main important words, which are very big words, the way I am using them, what I mean by them. So anybody reading it can get into the understanding of what I mean by that word. And that means my communication with the reader then is clearer and sharper if they do that, understand that, because words mean different things to different people. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that my take on this is that I recognize exactly what you just said. You know, we need words, and we need to sort of, if we use them, in particular when it comes to those various concepts, you know, that are flying around, that are sort of common. Although you have your own terms that you created, which I also appreciated, and then you define them with such clarity. But you know, what I'm recognizing sort of two sides of this. One is the need for certain words and clarification as to what they mean to a person speaking. So in this case, to you, what they mean to me. But I also recognize how much there's of too much attachment to words and concepts in particular, you know, and how sometimes they can become very heady, and that actually the more there's focus on the words and the concepts, you know, the conversations often end up being, like I said, at the level sort of they're more remain at the level of the mind and a sort of debate about these things, and then they're actually, rather than pointing to the truth behind those words, or what they're trying to point to. So yeah. Can we talk a little bit about that?
So what you're talking about is people using the mind and the intellect to build a kind of safe zone, the personality building a safe zone. Some people are very, you know, they've got a good mind and they're very safe in their kind of castle of their intellect and their theories and their concepts. So I think that's what you're referring to. And then the level of discussion stays in a certain level. So Gurdjieff had his theory of like the three centers. And one is like the head center, one is the feeling center, one is the moving center, which is basically the body, physical. And balance only comes when all centers are engaged. So what you're, I think, talking about there is when the head center is, people take refuge just in the intellect without, so big part of what I talk about and I write about is the feeling center. And, you know, and because a way for personalities to avoid feeling is to remain in the head. So I think what you're referring to is a kind of syndrome like that. But, you know, this is not against using the head either. It's just that it's
absolutely,
it's just a balance. So use that to avoid that is out of balance. So be open, so your intellect is sharp and clear in your understanding, but also the heart and the feelings are open. And
yeah. I mean, I honestly wish I could articulate myself the way you do, particularly in your book. I was so envious of that, seriously, because I personally have real trouble sort of really articulating the way I sort of see or experience things. I mean, part of it is because English is not my mother tongue, but also because I really feel like words are just not reliable, and sometimes, you know, it actually feels, as soon as the word comes out, it feels like a lie, like it's not it, you know. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is
I think your feeling comes over though.
Yes, absolutely. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I think in conversations about our true nature, it's so important to remember that whatever is spoken, whatever comes out of our mouth, you know, is just a perspective. It's an interpretation, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think there's a beauty in the various sort of interpretations and perspectives when people talk about their unique journeys and how they perceive the, you know, the true nature, or, you know, or awaken, whoever you want, or whoever they talk about. What I'm saying is that I think it's so important to remember that the perspective, the word, the description, the interpret is not this. I suppose that this is what I'm trying to say. And then I think that there are people who absolutely have an amazing ability to, you know, use the words with such clarity that they carry you know, this is when we talk about that they speak from clarity, or they, you know, they speak from direct experience. So it's, yes, they use words, and of course there's a sort of the intellectual side to it, but they're spoken from that place. And so that place really is powerfully felt, and so people connect with what's behind those words, with that place that those words are spoken from, rather than the words themselves, if that makes sense. Is that a bit clear as to what I'm trying to say?
It's like when you read a quote from the Buddha or Lao Tzu or something, and it was, you know, it's hundreds or thousands of years ago, and you read it and it just, you know, I used to do that. I write about this in the book, actually. I used to go to a bookshop in Covent Garden, which is gone now, and just browse at, you know, the spiritual books as you do. And I'd see a phrase from, I think one of them was Buddha, and it would just hit you. And it's just like a sentence, you know, but the energetic power and the truth in that sentence is strong. And if you're open to it and you have the capacity to understand it in some way, even if it's beyond logic, it will hit you, and it has amazing power. So I think that's what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes, and I mean, Jez, it's a mystery to me, and this is also part of what I love about these conversations. That to me, there is no arrival point in general on this on this journey, and there's also not one way of. Well, I'm just saying, we're attempting to understand these things, and we're attempting to describe them, and so on, and I love that. But I suppose I'm sort of one of those people that I like to express myself. I like to hear different perspectives. I will express my own perspective, but at the same time it sort of gets canceled as soon as I spoken it, because so that whatever comes next is a bit more fresh, if that makes sense, or a bit different. There's space, there's constant space left for something fresh, and maybe a different way of seeing to come up. Because even the example that you just gave, it can be a sentence that, you know, conveys this amazing feeling or this truth in such a powerful way. But how is it that sometimes we came across that one sentence multiple times and somehow it didn't land, so to speak, before, but it lands at a different time? And that's what I'm talking about. It's such a mystery of how and why this happens when it happens, right? Yeah.
I sometimes share things I've written or quotes from the book. And sometimes I'm thinking, is anybody going to get this? But you don't know. I put things out, and I have these meetings and I say things, and I don't know if anybody's going to get anything from it. But then, you know, twice recently I've had, God, when you said that was, you don't know what's going to be the thing that's going to hit the target, the arrow that's going to hit the target. And it's to do with 1,000 different things, like timing and where they're at in their life and what they're ready for. It's all about readiness. And so that's a lovely side of it, I think.
And that's the mystery that I'm talking about. I don't quite understand how that works. What I do know is that I'm just fascinated by it, and even what you're just saying to me just speaks to almost these two simultaneous things happening, where there seems to be this pure intelligence that's at work, that is a mystery in terms of why these things happen in certain times, and at certain times they don't. Why certain people, you know, wake up like this, and others, you know, practice and those sorts of things, and nothing seems to happen, and so on and so on. And then, you know, there's and then there are our ideas, you know, sort of mind created ideas about how things should be, or you know, what's the timing, how it's supposed to happen, when it's supposed to happen. And you know, it's,
you can forget that, can't you?
You can totally. So I mean, I think it's bound to be happening, you know, anyway, but it's just to rely on this. It's completely pointless, you know. But so I really want to talk about a topic that's actually not very glamorous as far as conversations about awakening go, and it's actually,
you're now in Matthew's role in the book, where
Tell me.
you can use any question to go into this, even if it's unglamorous, you know.
I love that, and that's
Yeah.
yeah, I absolutely love that.
Yeah.
And I love all the non-glamorous topics related to awakening. You know, the dirtier, the more challenging, the harder, the messier, the more painful,
the nitty
you know,
gritty.
so destroying, and all of that. Like, I love to bring it to table,
because like anybody can say, there's no one there, there's nothing to do. You've heard it 1,000 times, and anybody. So many people do say that. I'm interested too in the nitty gritty. Well, how does this affect your life? Practically. How does it affect your social life? How does it affect everything?
How does it affect your life? How does it affect your experience of life on a daily basis? You know, the relationships and so on. But one of the, you know, I actually came across you via Conscious TV.
Yeah.
And you had this really great interview there with Ian, where it was pretty much entirely dedicated to talking about your breakdown, you know, that I really want to talk about. And I remember being stunned by it, because you were the second person I came, or rather, it was the second time I came across a story where the breakdown was so dramatic. Because the first one was the book Collision with the Infinite. That was really, you know, I've never had anything like this before, that it can be this extreme. And then there was your interview on Conscious TV, and by the way, I'm going to put a link in the description to this particular conversation, in case someone wants to hear the entire story with a bit more detail. I really want to focus more on just the breakdown. Why do you think this happens? Why is it actually, even though it's not really talked about a lot, this is very much what's happening to people, either prior the awakening or after the awakening, or both, like you said. And we're talking psychological breakdown, we're talking about emotional breakdown, we're talking about spiritual breakdown. And so, you know, that topic of the breakdown alone is vast. So I don't know how we're going to manage to
we'll try
to sort of cover it. But I would love to just hear your thoughts straight away on that, given the fact that you really had it.
We're born in what I would call the natural state. We lose the natural state. We're going to have to go into a little bit of theory here, just to give a bit of context. And that happens through the wound, and we start to develop a personality, and the personality grows, and all our lives we live that personality, and we think it's who we are, and we forget that we are actually the natural state on which that grew, like a kind of that was like the host, that was it grew on top of that. So we've got this story. So I had my story. And my story was, in my story, you know, a big part of it was my career doing picture books. Some of them are behind me here.
I mean, come on, 45 children's books, I think 7 million copies sold. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was a lovely job, and it suited my talents, which were writing and drawing and painting and stuff. So it was a way of doing all of that in one job. So that was lovely. So, you know, nothing wrong with that. That was all fantastic. But there was another side to my life which wasn't addressed, which was, you know, which had a deep suffering in it, which is coming from what I call the wound, which is the moment when we lose the natural state of being that we come into this world with. And that happens differently for different people, but there's certainly a lot of parallels as to what that is. And that suffering, which was the personality, the way I talk about it, the personality's job is to kind of manage that suffering. So if we didn't have the personality to manage it, there would be chaos. There's too much to feel, there's too much pain, and the personality comes in and takes control. And it says, don't feel that, push that away, push that into the subconscious. And it does lots of other things. It has strategies to, if we feel we have shame, it has strategies to try and gain acceptance from people, and all these games and strategies that everyone develops. And they're all around keeping down the pain of that wound. So that wound is in everyone, but most people go throughout their whole lives and it's managed. They never really hit it. It's going to affect their lives, don't get me wrong. It's still there and they're going to have suffering from it.
Jez, when you say wound, are you saying basically stuff that's been experienced, that's been painful or difficult or challenging, and that was basically repressed, where we developed perhaps coping mechanisms around that, but never really fully met that?
Well, what that sort of comes afterwards, but what I mean by the wound is the moment where, okay, the best way to get into it is to imagine a newborn baby. And the newborn baby is simply being. It has no personality yet. It's got none of all that stuff that needs to gain love. It's already in love. It doesn't even have a mind to talk about it or interpret it. It is it.
Yes.
And so what I mean when I say the wound is the moment where that is lost. And that happens for everyone, and it may be the moment when their parents come home and dad's had an argument at work and he shouts at mum and the baby gets shocked, or love is withdrawn from the baby because the mother's depressed, or many, many reasons. But there is a moment where that expansiveness of just being as an in the absolute of the baby is lost. And then we become what we become.
It's almost like would you say it's like a birth of that separate self, so to speak? Would you say that?
Well, okay. We need to learn to be in this relative world. So I've just described the being expansiveness of the absolute. So the baby is still so fresh from that there's almost no distinction between the two. Well, there is, because there's a body, right? But there's no mind really yet making that difference conscious. So as we grow, that difference becomes more conscious and we tune more to the relative, because we have to in order to function in the world.
Of course.
We have to know how to grab food physically to feed ourselves and all of that. So our parents teach us that, and that is their job, and it's a beautiful thing. And in order to do that, we need a self. So this is what I mean by self, lowercase self, not the Hindu. Self in Hinduism, I believe, means kind of God, like the Godhead. So it's just a functioning part of humanity that is needed for me to say, I'm Jez, you're Maggie, I'm talking to you, this is how I work the computer, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so self on its own is not a problem, but the personality is different. The personality is the bit that deals with the wound and the pain of the wound and the knock-on effect of that.
Yes, I really want you to explain that, because I can see straight away how the way or rather the way personality, that word, is generally understood is very different to what you're saying or how you're using it in your book. So can you explain a little bit more? What do you mean by personality?
So the way I use it is actually, that I found out later, is the same way that Gurdjieff used it and John Klein and some other teachers. It's the full self. So we've just talked about the self, which is needed to a sense of separation that we need to function in the world. But the personality is a totally different thing. So, I'm just trying to think of an example. So, if somebody learns to have shame, they think that, if they experience a lack of love as part of their wound, well, let's face it, who doesn't? Then the mind can start to come in and say, oh, there's something wrong with me, otherwise I would receive that. So a sort of shame thing gets built in. Now that shame thing is nothing to do with the natural state. It's not expansive, it's actually contracting. And you imagine that in all areas of, different areas of our psychology, the need. So then you develop a pattern of needing to please people, because then they'll like me, because otherwise I don't feel lovable. There's not enough self-love. So the person, I'm trying to think of one example. So in my groups, we talk about every side of personalities, anything that comes up, and we can talk about anything that comes up here. But I'm just using that as an example of one side of personality. So it's like the false self. But we think that's who we are. So if you have a pattern of shame and lack of self-worth, you become aligned with that, and it becomes your experience of life. And that's what I call the dream of personality. It's true to the personality because it's created by that experience and the beliefs that are built up from that experience. Side of that, it's not real. So when I talk about life beyond personality, in that example, you can see I'm talking about waking up from that dream of personality, which isn't real. You still have a self, you're still living this life. Yeah, go ahead.
Does personality for you also mean, the conditioning, the stories, the interpretations that we tell ourselves, about other people, about life and so on? Does that, is that included in?
Oh yeah, and the conditioning from the group personality out there, from the religion of the family or the beliefs of the family, or if a mother has a thing about guilt, then that can be passed on.
Yes.
All that conditioning feeds in and creates this entity. It's an entity, which is your particular version of personality. And that is the root of suffering. Now, like when I talk about suffering, there is suffering in life. So this is why words are important, because some people say, oh, this is beyond all suffering. Well, you have to be dead to be beyond all suffering. That's not an accurate expression. You have to go a step further and say, what do we mean by suffering? Well, there's different types of suffering. Some suffering is just part and parcel of being a human being. If you're really sick, if your loved one leaves you, or whatever it is, that's the kind of suffering that anyone feels. I don't care if you're awake or not awake. You feel that because you're a human being. And this is all about feeling. But personality suffering is different, because personality is the kind of suffering that comes from that identification with all that conditioning. So if you identify as the one who feels shame and feels they're not good enough, you will feel and experience the suffering that comes from that belief. So that's the kind of suffering that can be unhooked from.
Right.
So that's how I talk about suffering.
Yeah. So you were saying that you were leading this, on the outside, a pretty okay life, I would say. I would say more than okay,
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah.
Having a job actually that you really enjoy was your passion, and you were incredibly successful doing that. I don't remember whether at the time you were also in any way interested in anything spiritual at all, or it was just purely career and so on. Because what I'm heading with this is, what happened then?
Yeah, so I did have another life that was interested in spiritual stuff, and this came out from when I was a young boy, a teenager, and this is kind of what I cover a bit in the first book, my story of having what I call openings, just down the road from where you and I are, actually, by the river in Kingston. So I'd be cycling and I'd have these openings. I didn't know what they were. Nobody told me what they were. Well, I didn't tell anyone I'd even had them. It was just between me and life. But it was an experience beyond my personality as it was at that point in my life. I was probably 16 or something. And these happened throughout my life, maybe up until my 30s, 40s. So there was a spiritual life, which was really trying to find out from these guys, these gurus and teachers who were meant to know what that was. Obviously, they seem to know, they're meant to know. So you look at it, So I did have a spiritual life. I was seeking, But in answer to your question, what happened with the breakdown was the side of my life that I've just expressed, the personality suffering and the conditioning and the suffering that came from that, from my wound, for most of that career was well buried and well handled, and it didn't interfere with this top level where I was this sort of successful author, illustrator. But then it came a point where it started kind of invading it and crossing into it. This came, first of all, when I was giving a talk up in Manchester to a group of teachers and librarians. Just before I went on, something happened where, I'd done lots of these talks. I knew how to do them and I enjoyed doing them. I have a kind of introvert side, but I also have an extrovert side. And that extrovert side was quite well placed to do that sort of thing. I was talking about something I loved, so it was okay. It was good for me. But before this one, I suddenly, before going on, I didn't know how to do it anymore. I just lost that center that knew how to do it. And yeah, it's horrible. I mean, it's just I don't know how to describe it. It's like everyone's worst nightmare, really. It's like you forget how to function, how to do the job that you're there to do. Somehow I got through it by kind of sheer willpower and drawing on memory reserves of how to do it. But it took a lot of energy. And it shook me terribly because something I thought was solid in me wasn't. Anyway, that was like a kind of, with earthquakes, you get pre-shocks. This was like a kind of pre-shock of the breakdown. And it was maybe half a year before it happened. Mm-hmm. I kind of pulled myself together and I got through the next bit. But 18 years ago, just a couple of days ago, it's a anniversary. It was the 15th of August, 2004. So we were driving on holiday to Cornwall and we got as far as Reading. And that's when it happened. It felt like the one who knew how to do things just kind of collapsed. If you imagine it like a pot and it was just shattered into pieces on the floor. And I couldn't go on holiday. I mean, I couldn't drive home. I didn't know how to be. I didn't know who I was. Everything that gives us the security of knowing how to function and be who we are just kind of fell.
I mean, I can't even comprehend.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it.
Or even or even try to
it's hard to imagine even.
That must the sheer terror, and in particular, terror. And this is one of the reasons why I really love to talk about it. As of course, I'm not happy that, and I don't love the fact that you've had to go through it in such an extreme way. But the reason why I love to talk about it is because this is the reality for many people, whether this is, like I said, prior to awakening or after awakening, or just regardless, this is something that's happening to people. And in that moment, even though you were a seeker, even though you were familiar with certain teachings, all of that, I'm assuming, went off the window. And completely.
Yeah, totally.
And so, yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that. Can you tell us a bit more about what was breaking down in your experience? What did you feel was completely gone? Like in sort of more detail, if we could talk about that.
It's such a big subject. It's hard to know where to go or even begin with it.
I know.
What was breaking down? Well, my personality was breaking down. But for me, it happened in a very dramatic way. It doesn't happen like that for everyone. But for me, my wife always laughs. It's like typical you to do it in such a dramatic one. I mean, I'm not saying it just happened like that, but that's the way it began, was very dramatic. One moment I was doing this job, I was out there in the world. The next moment, I couldn't do that.
Wow.
Yeah. So I was living here and my life became incredibly shrunken. I became like a monk, not out of choice or anything. I didn't choose it, but it was because all I could manage just to get through each day. So a lot of the trauma kind of came at once. And then I was left with this life which didn't fit the life I had before. So everything that worked for me before didn't work anymore. The background feeling was of kind of a terror. I was sort of living in a kind of terror because we don't realize how much we depend on this sense of self. And without that, you're not really equipped to work in the world, to deal with the world and other people. And so even small things would be really difficult, you know, talking to people. That, I mean, going to a supermarket, my God, things like that really freak me out. So of course that affects the body a lot too. So you're going through a lot of body stuff and the heart's really upset. And I mean, I just literally existed. I got through another day. It was literally like that. And by the
way, we're not suggesting that every person who's on this journey,
they've all turned off by now anyway.
Like, we're absolutely not suggesting that every single person has to go through it in such an extreme way. What I'm saying is that this is, you know, whether it's a dark night of the soul or whether it's emotional breakdown, psychological breakdown, but actually also what I would call like a spiritual breakdown, where for many people who are seeking and sort of you know, used to a certain spiritual lifestyle, doing certain thing, whether it's practices and having had some kind of a whole lifestyle built around certain idea of what being spiritual means, even that collapses.
Oh yeah, I mean, right? When the breakdown actually happened and I was at this, you know, pulled off the motorway in Reading, I was like, you know, I know all the tricks, you know, get on the earth, ground yourself, breathe. Well, forget it. It didn't matter what I did. It was way beyond all of that, you know. But what can we draw from this? The point is, I think that if people are serious about wanting to wake up, they won't go through that, but they will go through their own. There's no way you can avoid it's a shedding of a skin, and the skin is the life of the personality that you thought you were. And that is, it's going to be very rare if that's not going to have pain in it, because there's attachment to that and there's comfort involved in that, you know, and it's the comfort of being involved with a group personality that works, you know, everyone out there, all the groups and the society works in a certain way, and we get a lot of comfort from that. And in this, you wake up outside of all that. So you lose the comfort of belonging to that.
I mean, to be frank, Jez, I am yet to meet a person who had an awakening, even if it was just a glimpse, maybe, or an opening, as you call it, an extremely powerful one, where that sort of thing, let's call it a crisis or a breakdown, like I said, that it wouldn't have happened. Like I really think it's not possible for it to not happen, either prior or after.
No, that's right. But I had a turning point, and it was in about the September of the year it happened, or October. I was on the sofa downstairs and I started writing. And it's funny, his links a bit with what we were saying earlier about writing, but I was all I did was wrote what I was feeling, but there was a kind of distance to it in the way I wrote. So I used everything that happened and everything that came up and every feeling, and I kind of examined it, laid it out, and there was this kind of gap, there was this distance. So like, as long as I was watching it and detailing it, what it was, and examining it, inquiring, I wasn't right in the middle of it, at least at that moment anyway. And this is a very important theme in what I talk about, which is the choiceless awareness. There's awareness that isn't part of that trauma. And that is kind of the way out in a way. And that's what I found. So that I started writing that day, and I wrote, I mean, I've even got the book somewhere, and I've got 3 massive books of this writing of every day, what was coming up. And that was the start of the turnaround, but that wasn't the end. That was just the start, you know. Yeah. So I inquiry for me in this is like part and parcel of it. You can't wake up out of the personality, or wake up without knowing what it is you're waking up from, what you thought you were. and how it works. What are the mechanics of it? What are the beliefs in it? What are the way it manifests? Why am I trying to please this person? Why do I care what they think about me? You know, all that sort of stuff. You can unlock that. And this is why I say some things you can't understand. There's the great mystery behind it all. You'll never understand that. That's fine. But there's some things you can, and you need to understand in order to get to the great mystery in such a way that you're just living it all the time.
Yeah. So this was a sort of first turning point with you starting to write about your experience, and also for the first time experiencing, and this was beautiful, that you know, the way you described it, that the gap, you're no longer sort of in it, you're now sort of slightly out of it, but just enough to gain some kind of equilibrium anyway in that moment. But
can I just point out, Maggie, that it's not that you still, that doesn't protect you from feeling. So I'm not talking about jumping up to the head, so you intellectualize stuff and you don't feel. It was nothing to do with not feeling. I would feel, and I would have the choices to awareness. It wasn't an escape from feeling. A big turnaround happened for me with the breakdown within those 6-7 years, when I realized, and this came out of my writing, that the breakdown was my teacher. And when I saw it as my teacher, rather than this absolute horror monster, I mean, it was a kind of monster, but it was an awe-inspiring monster that could teach me things that nothing else could teach me. And when I got in line with that, something clicked, and it was still really hard, and I still had to go through what I went through, but I was kind of in a line with it as a kind of teaching and a something that worked on me.
I think this is extremely important, because as I was listening to you even now describing this moment, to me it really was a massive shift, in that there's no denying, like you said, that there still was massive pain, and it's not like you started all of a sudden to enjoy your experience, not at all. But to me it was this beginning of the end of resistance to what was going on, and I think this is such an important part of the conversation about these uncomfortable feelings and emotions that resurface. In fact, I would say that after the awakening, they can resurface even in a much more powerful way than before, because there's no filters anymore, so to speak. And you know, and in particular, I think after the shift, or after the awakening, there's almost, I mean, there is no choice, to be frank. There is no, because all the maneuvers, the psychological maneuvers, the spiritual maneuvers, and all sorts of tricks of the mind that we've been so used to using, whether consciously or not, over our entire lives to get rid of a disturbing feeling or emotion, to numb it, to reframe it, to bypass it, you know, all of that goes. And so what you're left with is just whatever comes to the surface. And often what comes to the surface, it's a very lively, incredibly uncomfortable experience, whether this is grief, whether this is pain, whether it's anger. It's there to be felt. There actually isn't
there's no buffer to it.
There's no buffer. There's no buffer anymore.
But if you are identified with your personality, then what will be happening in that moment will be an echo chamber of that personality's stuff, and its conditioning, and its patterns, and its emotions, and it's all of that. So it's not, the good news is that it's what you describe could be like hell, because it's like shit just keeps coming up, and all you got to do is feel it, and it's just horrible, right? So, so it's not just that, because as I said, the kind of suffering that comes from personality, yes, it will come up. But if it's come up and seen with choice awareness, and if the understanding pierces through what's creating it, it doesn't get created anymore. That's the good news. Do you know what I mean? So it's not just misery, like suffering all the time. It's the end of personality suffering, but that can involve you facing that suffering. Well, it not can, it will.
Yeah, and this is the part which I absolutely struggle to sort of convey, in that you know, a lot of these conversations are sometimes, and that to me is also normal, you know, the sort of this thing, it's either this or it's that. And to me, the conversations about what it's like, you know, this whole the experiencing of life from this very different place, so to speak, is about this, and it's about both, and it's about paradoxes, but only the paradoxes to the mind, because the mind, it's very difficult for the mind to comprehend, at least at the beginning, that I can feel pain, for example, or grief or anger, but there is also an aliveness to it, an acceptance of it at the same time, and no suffering attached to it.
Yeah.
I mean, wouldn't you say? I mean, for the mind, it's like, how can I feel pain and not suffer anymore? You know, or suffer because it's happening. You know, I have really hard time conveying that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mentioned the natural state earlier on, and the way I talk about it is the natural state has 4 qualities, and one of them is what I would call full feeling engagement with life. So when we're babies, we don't yet have a system that that chooses to not feel certain things. We just feel. So part of the natural state of living is to feel. So that's what the personality kind of clamps down and contracts, because it learns that that's painful, don't go there, and close that down, and etc., etc. And you end up as a kind of contracted. The being gets contracted. So full feeling engagement with life is, it's weird, because I hear what you're saying. You hear some teachers and people talking spiritual stuff, and it seems to be about this projection of an ideal, where the ideal seems to be that you're kind of inhuman. You don't really feel anything anymore. You're beyond this, you're beyond that, you're beyond. And that seems to be something that certain spiritual types have created, a kind of ideal of enlightenment like that. Now, I kind of know where it comes from, and I'm sure you do too, because there are sides to this that are like that. You know, that you've just talked about, the kind of distance, and that you beyond, something's always beyond suffering. So there is a side to it like that. But if you just take that and put it on a pedestal and say that's all this is, that's a mind game, because that denies the fact that we are human, and to be human means to feel. And if you feel, some things are painful as a human being. So it's a bit like with the Gurdjieff thing. You don't just come from the head, you come from the heart and the head, and you're in the body, and all 3 have to be open. You can't just reside in a bunch of concepts, spiritual concepts, that don't really align with the truth of what it means to be a human being.
And in many ways, you know, and I continue to say that in many ways I feel that, you know, the awakening or a shift, you know, in a way is only a beginning of actually of being a human being, of a really intimate engagement with our humanness, rather than the way it begins when we first start sort of seeking. It really is mainly about running away from our human experience. You know, it's trying to get rid of suffering, and trying to not, you know, of the, you know, getting rid of uncomfortable feelings and emotions and so on. And then afterwards there is, you know, not only no running away, it's actually the freedom to experience it all. So in other words, you know, rather than the freedom from the human experience, it's more of a freedom to have a full-blown human experience, and not freak out, by it.
Yeah, yeah. But the difference is, and there is a difference, that it's not a full, again, this is why I talk about personality a lot, because the experience is not of the dream that personality is creating. Well, it may be residue from that. We've had this story laid down in our body, mind, and it's sort of, you know, it doesn't just go like that. And, you know, there's a healing of that can happen.
I love that this was another reason why I loved your book so much, because that part, again, is very rarely talked about. So I really kind of want to say two things, because one thing that I noticed, and I it's first time that I'm I think talking about it in that way, is that 10 or 11 years ago, I had what I call my very first awakening. Right. And the reason why I call awakening was because it really it changed everything for me. Like, you know, the peace of mind that I knew existed regardless of what's going on in our heads or in our lives, that I knew of since I was a kid. I experienced it in that moment
as an adult.
As an adult, that was 10, 11 years ago. And I, you know, for me, what that looked like was, I just had a realization that we live in a thought-created reality. This is the best way I could describe it. That I was not only that I wasn't my thoughts, but that, or the stories that I was telling myself, but that also I wasn't even the thinker of thoughts. That the thoughts were arising, sort of. And that's the best way I can describe it. And I cannot simply describe what that felt like or what it did, but that knowing never went away, never. And for about a year from that moment, I lived in what I can only describe as a neutral state. And believe me, stuff that happened even that particular year in my life, there were two events in my life that were incredibly, let's just call them disturbing and deeply disturbing. And I know that had those moments happened before that, it would break me. Psychologically, it would break me. And yet here I was, dealing with these events. Were they upsetting? Yes. Was I shocked? Yes. But there was a peace underneath it all that I cannot describe. And that also allowed me to deal with these circumstances with such grace, and that I was shocked, just being an observer of that happening. But here's what happened. This was my genuine place. This was genuinely how I was functioning. And I really thought at the time, because I was not into spirituality or any spiritual teachings, really, I assumed that this is what my life was going to be like. From then on, innocently. Also because that neutral state lasted for such a long time. And so, and then I gradually began to feel that peace being disturbed. There were emotions resurfacing. There were reactions of my, like, more visceral, more almost like my physiology, neurology sort of reacting. And I started freaking out. And my first thought was, this should not be happening. This should not be happening anymore. Why is this happening? And what, again, innocently I began to do is to just say, oh, it's just a thought. Oh, it's just a thought. And this was my way of using concept to bypass. Right? So then I literally felt myself shutting down almost. I became a bit like a robot, And it's funny because my nature, my sort of naturally, I'm quite sort of lively. And I really wasn't myself even in that anymore. And you know, even in my connections with people closest to me also suffered, because even I would say even to them, you know, like if they were sharing some pain or something, I'd be like, oh, you know, don't worry about it, it's just a thought. I mean, talking
well, you
about
applied to them what you applied to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you know, I wasn't like, honestly talking about being a spiritual asshole, you know. It's I mean, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if people thought of me that I was an asshole, because I had zero compassion, you know, because I couldn't meet what was arising in me that was disturbing and difficult. So how could I possibly meet that in another person?
Yeah,
and
not just that, but you had a motive to interpret it that way to them, because then that kept you in that belief.
Yes, but again, it was innocent. And as I was reading your book, and you know, as I'm having these conversations, reading these books, I think that this is what happens to many people. And again, this was really innocent. Like, I really didn't know any better. I didn't know. I was not familiar with people like yourself or many other people who would say, you know, you have to meet that, whatever is arising, you have to be with, you know, you have to meet that. And so this is where, you know, I later on understood exactly what you're saying, that you know, our conditioning or trauma or anything doesn't prevent us from awakening. Absolutely not. But it doesn't, with that, in that moment, it doesn't delete, you know, or cancel, you know, exactly what you said, the things that are sort of memorized by our neurology or by our nervous system. So in the same way, you know, I made peace with my mother and my past and everything, you know, many years ago. Like, I have nothing, I don't even have anything to forgive. There's no issues there. And yet sometimes the way I react to the way my mom says something is completely illogical, that is not even related to a thought, right? Or something to do with the mind. It's just my body sort of reacting to something. That I'm noticing between then and later on is that, you know, at the time it really felt as though I was somehow choosing not to go there, so to speak, you know, so I would tell it's just a thought, and then I would distract myself in all kinds of ways, anything to avoid being with whatever emotion has come up or whatever disturbing thoughts and so on. Whereas the difference now is that I do not have this option.
No, but I think what you do have, and this is how it seems to work, is like, if you have an awakening or you know that place, then you know, there's a kind of grace period where you're kind of living in this world that's seeing the world through those eyes. That place that you've experienced, that you know, then it becomes opens doors for you to face whatever you have to face in a way that you couldn't have before. And you said that. You said, if I'd had this, I would have been broken, you know. You've got, it's almost like having an anchor that allows you the kind of stability to be able to, because you know what you know of, let's call it for now. It allows you the presence to be able to face whatever you have to face. And as you say, the other side of it is you don't have the buffer zone anymore. You don't have the personality that's kind of, well, you did for a while, but that burnt off, right? And then you're left with the raw feeling of like no defenses against what's coming up. So then you've got no defenses against what's coming up, but you do have a presence that can take it. And then there's this kind of sacred alchemy that goes on, whereby whatever it is, it gets revealed. Because in the personality, it doesn't get revealed. It's too well protected. It's locked away. It can't come up. Your life is too well structured to let it come up. But now it can come up. And because it can, I would say it wants to come up, because life seems to want to heal itself. It seems to, you know, if there's a block, it seems to want to kind of release the block and allow the flow. So we've all got, you know, we're all human and we've all got those things in our systems, and to, you know, greater or lesser extent. And who are we to say they shouldn't be there? If they're there, they're there. That's the way life went.
Absolutely.
You've got a block about this, or you've got a strong feeling about that. So again, the common denominator of all of this is that thing you said, that you don't have resistance to it anymore.
Yeah.
So you're not creating your life. You're not saying, I want it to be like that. It's more like, this is how life is, and I surrender to it. And if something difficult comes up, but my relationship to it is different, because you don't have that buffer zone to it. And then life does what it does to you. If you need to be burnt out in some area, that's what happens. And it's all good. Even if in the moment, it just feels terrible. You don't have the choice anymore. You never did, but you know you don't now.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But you know, one of the reasons why I told that story is because I can see how, you know, a lot of these, and you talk about it in your book as well, all the absolutist ideas, you know, there's no self, there's no story, you know, there's this, there's that, and again, you know, these terms, while fundamentally they speak to the fundamental truth, but they're often really hijacked by, I call it the mind, you know, and used as a way to bypass things. And for me at the time, it's just a thought, right? Where in the moment when there was suffering, it was no longer you know, a direct experience of the truth of it. It was now trying to manufacture it, you know, by saying it, oh, it's just a thought, as a way to shield myself from the experience.
And it's that you obviously gained that was happening is what delivered you beyond it, isn't it? Again, this is like when I was writing on the sofa down there, the awareness of what was happening, you're already not in the middle of that. What is it? I mean, a kind of defensive strategy to protect yourself from that pain. You're in the choices awareness rather than in the middle of that strategy. You've seen it. Yeah,
absolutely. But I think that this is where the detachment happens. You know, this is where there can be a tendency for some people after waking to become robot-like. These defenses still happen, and sometimes these defenses are extremely obvious, and sometimes these defenses are not obvious, and they're incredibly subtle. And this is where that inquiry that you talks about is something, in my view, that should never end. That inquiry is valuable sort of before the awakening, but it's also incredibly valuable afterwards, to spot, as a way to literally spot, you know, all these subtle ways in which, you know, the old tricks sort of want to resurface. I mean, again, we can talk about whether there is anything to spot or dig for, or is it simply something that comes up to the surface and makes itself known, which has been very much my experience. But again, it plays out differently to different people.
Well, I would say if you've stopped inquiring, you're not awake. I mean, they would probably say the opposite. Seeking's over, there's nothing, you know. Who stops inquiring? Who's doing that, you know? To be alive is to be curious and to feel and to explore, whether you're exploring the personality or the end of your identification with personality after it, and what life like that is like. So to me, that's like breathing. That's just part of life. So the idea that all ends, or that a journey in life as a human being ends, is just life negative. I thought of something this morning. I would say I'm more attuned to the Taoist way of thinking. Now, the absolutist will say, there's no one there, right? And the Taoist would say, you know, if I'm drinking this,
Mm-hmm.
the Taoist would say, I feel the weight of this glass in my hand. And that's the difference. That says everything. The absolutist says, there's no one there, there's no glass, there's no water. The Taoist says, there's a glass of water in my hand, what appears to be my hand. It's heavy, I can taste it, blah, blah, blah. And what I'm trying to point to here is that Taoism it's a beautiful expression of mountains are mountains again, meaning that you have actually seen there's no one there. So I'm not disputing that part of it at all. That is part of waking up. You see beyond the personal self, the personality, the whole thing. But the idea that you then deny the arising of the relative is just ridiculous to me. It's like, it's not seeing life as it is. Life apparently appears to me as this life. I've got a name, I've got a house, blah, blah, blah. And that's what I live. I have relations, I have feelings, and that is how life expresses through me. To go around and deny that in any way is not waking up, as far as I'm concerned. It's a misappropriation of a truth that is seen in this, but it's only one half of the truth. The other half is it focuses on the absolute side, but it doesn't embrace the relative side of manifestation and appearance. And therefore it's out of balance. And therefore it's a mind fuck, really.
We could go into that one, but I'm also aware of the time. But yeah, I mean, I personally, I don't understand that.
The absolutist approach.
Yes, I'm a very curious person, and I really have been reflecting on that and sort of trying to figure out how that is possible, because again, and I always say that I'm only ever sharing my perspective on how things look to me in the moment, because even that's been evolving, you know. This is what I'm saying. I'm not getting attached to just, you know, this is how it looks like to me today, and therefore it's going to look like this tomorrow and a year after. But so far, I can't understand that. To me personally, part of or the realizing our true nature is that nothing is excluded. And this is where I don't know, the moment you exclude or deny anything, you're literally manufacturing separation. So I figured out through my experience, but only in hindsight, from where I'm at in a moment, I can see how that bypassing was happening, you know, how it's just the thought was used as a concept to basically not meet the reality of the moment. Because to me, this is, you know, the beauty of awakening is meeting what is as it is. As it is. Right.
Because who's the one deciding not to meet it as it is? And this
exactly. It's not even, it's even beyond acceptance, because accepting
it's like you've got a choice about it.
Someone who can choose not to accept it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, but of course, but this is where the words sort of fail.
Who's excluding certain parts of life to fit in with that belief or that thought that there's no one there? Who's the one doing that? There's still somebody there who's making a choice to exclude something. It might be subconscious, but still. Whereas I'm very much with you. Like a line I keep saying is like, everything has to be seen. See life as it is. It sounds so simple. See life as it is.
I know.
What does that really mean? That means seeing it beyond your personality's idea of it and what it wants to be and the strategies it has. So it's being outside of that. And then you see, oh, I'm feeling grief. then you're feeling grief.
Yeah, it almost, I would say that it almost feels like it comes with a full stop. And I think that that's the difference, in a sense that you meet what arises as it is in the moment, but perhaps minus interpreting of that.
Yeah.
And more importantly, like for me, I suppose the biggest difference is that thought that something should not be happening in the moment just never appears.
Yeah.
And I suppose that this is the biggest, if I were to sort of in a nutshell say that the difference is that whatever whatever arises, whether it's grief or pain or anger or whatever, you know, it's or a thought or thoughts, you know, the war with that has come to an end.
What a beautiful thing that is. I mean, isn't it?
I mean, yeah. And so this is why I'm so completely moved by the aliveness of that, because it doesn't mean detachment. It doesn't mean that you stop feeling. It doesn't mean that your humanness ends and you enter this kind of elevated state of sorts. No, you're actually you're both your humanness and your true nature are one and the same, and there's this just aliveness, the freedom to be, you know, minus the interpretations, minus the I should not be feeling this way, this should not be happening.
Well, that's a freedom in itself. That's a kind of definition of a freedom, isn't it? What you've just described, wouldn't you say?
I think so. I actually, it's funny that you say that, because I thought about it yesterday, and funny enough, I even found the word freedom to be limited in that.
A little bit what?
I even found the word freedom a bit limited.
Yeah.
And so this is why I'm such a, I love words, but that's why I say that I'm not really relying on words, and I don't recommend relying on words too much, because, you know, it's such a, what was Rumi said, that the silence is the language of God, everything else is poor translation, and I totally agree that it's everything we're talking about is just a poor translation of trying to convey the unconveyable. You know, that sort of thing. But yeah, I think I love, currently, if I were to pick two words, it would be aliveness and radical openness, in that this openness where no one is being open.
Yeah.
It sounds really crazy. I'm aware, but
I totally understand it. I think it's a really good way of putting it. Yeah.
It's just infinite space to where experiencing of everything that has to be experienced happens. You know, it's like I think this is the closest I can get. What tell me, if you were to tell in a nutshell what this feels like to you, sort of, what would you say?
I mean, right now I couldn't do better than that. I think that was great what you just said.
Gosh, my ego is absolutely satisfied by what you just
You need my approval. No, I think you said it beautifully. I really do. I mean, you know, I could come up with something, but you know, I don't want to.
I get it. Yeah, I get it.
You did it beautifully. So I think what you've just said, and the way you said it and the way you came to it, was so real and honest. And it did it. I couldn't top that, you know. Yeah.
Should since my ego is satisfied, should we end here?
Yeah, it's a good place to end. You can sit in the glow of that. But that's just what's arising too.
Yeah, exactly, which is amazing, right?
And you accept it, right? But nobody accepts it.
Exactly. Jez, thank you so much. I think that we're going to meet again. Something tells me, one way or another,
That would be lovely. Yeah.
whether it's for another conversation or anything else. Then I'd be absolutely thrilled, because it's been amazing to have this conversation with you. And thank you so much for being so patient with me, sharing part of my story that I actually never shared in this way before, in terms of what was happening.
I feel we had a traveling conversation, and that was part of it. You sharing, I don't want to just talk about me. I think it was great. You shared it. It was very real, and I felt you in it, you know. Everybody's got their own way to this and their own way into it. And so, you know, it's I feel honored that you shared it with me, and because it's obviously so important to you.
And I'm so grateful that I met you on this journey, and it kind of worked out today somehow.
Yeah, it did, as it always does, doesn't
As it always does.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jez. I hope you enjoyed our conversation, and who knows, maybe we'll meet again for another one. But in the meantime, I hope you're all well, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.